In the world of Paul's New Testament letters, most modern scholars only accept 7 out of 13 attributed to him. This leaves a tough choice for believers: either discard 6 letters from the Bible, or grapple with the notion of possible deceit within the New Testament. The writers of these disputed letters posed as Paul, urging honesty while deceiving others. But if modern scholarship's arguments falter, and evidence confirms Paul is the true author of these letters, it's their credibility that suffers, not the New Testament's. Now, let's examine Ephesians and Colossians, often bundled together due to their resemblances, and explore their authorship. In his book Forged, Writing in the Name of God, Why the Bible's Authors Are Not Who We Think They Are, New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman puts forth 3 primary arguments against the authenticity of these letters. These arguments are put forth as a representation of why scholarship on a whole rejects their authenticity. Let's take a look at his first argument. Ehrman writes, and I quote, "For one thing, the writing style is not Paul's. Paul usually writes in short, pointed sentences. The sentences in Ephesians are long and complex. In Greek, the opening statement of thanksgiving, all 12 verses, is one sentence. There's nothing wrong with extremely long sentences in Greek. It's just not the way Paul wrote. It's like Mark Twain and William Faulkner. They both wrote correctly, but you would never mistake the one for the other." Some scholars have pointed out that in the 100 or so sentences in Ephesians, 9 of them are over 50 words in length. Compare this with Paul's own letters. Philippians, for example, has 102 sentences, with 1 of which is over 50 words. Galatians has 181 sentences, again with only 1 over 50 words. The book also has an inordinate number of words that don't otherwise occur in Paul's writings, 116 altogether, well higher than the average, 50% more than Philippians, for example, which is about the same length. Now, on the face of things, Ehrman definitely seems like he has a point. The way that this letter is written does indeed stand out. It does have these super long sentences that you might not even notice in modern translations. Scholars call this particular style pleonastic, meaning that it's really full, with tons of extra bits like phrases, clauses, and synonyms stacked up one after the other. But here's the twist. That crazy long-winded style, it's mainly in the first half of the letter, which is filled with prayers and things that sound rather creedal. The second half, way more in line with how Paul usually writes. Unless we're suggesting 2 different people wrote this thing, and that's not a serious idea, maybe the unusual style in the first half fits with the grand prayers and big ideas there. When Paul gets deep into heavy themes in his other letters, his style can get just as flowery. Just check out Romans 8:28 through 39 or 11:33 through 36. You could say that some of the unique words might come from traditional teachings, and that explains some of the Christological creeds that we see in Ephesians 1 and Colossians 1 as well. Also, having 3 separate prayer sections in the letter of Ephesians probably affects how the writing style and wording differ. Let's consider Ehrman's second objection. He writes, "But the main reason for thinking that Paul didn't write Ephesians is that what the author says in places does not jibe with what Paul himself says in his own letters. Ephesians 2, 1 through 10, for example, certainly looks like Paul's writing, but just on the surface. Here's in Paul's authentic letters, we learn that believers were separated from God because of sin, but have been made right with God exclusively through his grace, not as the result of works." But here, oddly, Paul includes himself as someone who, before coming to Christ, was carried away by the passions of our flesh, doing the will of the flesh and the senses. This doesn't sound like the Paul of the undisputed letters, who says that he had been blameless with respect to the righteousness of the law, quoting Philippians 3:4. In addition, even though he is talking about the relationship of Jew and Gentile in this letter, the author does not speak about salvation apart from the works of the law as Paul does. He speaks instead of salvation apart from doing good deeds. That simply was not the issue Paul addressed. I'm going to keep this short. This argument really doesn't hold up, at all. Ehrman seems to overlook Paul's struggles with covetousness, like what he mentions in Romans 7, where Paul talks about how he faces temptation and wrestles with doing the right thing and following the law. If we follow Bart's reasoning, it'd be like saying another of Paul's letters disproves the authenticity of Romans, and of course no scholar doubts that Paul wrote Romans. This is just not at all a convincing argument. Furthermore, Ephesians does say that Jesus set aside in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. What exactly is Ehrman reading here? Let's now move on to Ehrman's final complaint. This one's a little bit lengthy, so bear with me. Ehrman writes, "Moreover, this author indicates that believers have already been saved by the grace of God. As it turns out, the verb saved in Paul's authentic letters is always used to refer to the future. Salvation is not about something people already have. It's what they will have when Jesus returns on the clouds of heaven and delivers his followers from the wrath of God. Relatedly, and most significantly, Paul was emphatic in his own writings that Christians who had been baptized had died to the powers of the world that were aligned with the enemies of God. They had died with Christ, but they had not been raised with Christ. That would happen at the end of time, when Jesus returned and all people, living and dead, would be raised up to face judgment. That's why in Romans 6:1-4, Paul is emphatic. Those who are baptized have died with Christ, and they will be raised up with him at Jesus' second coming. Paul was extremely insistent on this point that the resurrection of believers was a future physical event, not something that had already happened. One of the reasons he wrote 1 Corinthians was precisely because some of the Christians in that community took an opposing point of view and maintained that they were already enjoying a resurrected existence with Christ now, that they were already enjoying the benefits of salvation. Paul devotes 1 Corinthians 15 to showing that no, the resurrection is not something that had happened yet. It is a future physical event yet to occur. Christians have not been raised with Christ, but contrasts his statement with what Ephesians says, quote, "Even when we were dead, through our trespasses, God made us alive together with Christ and raised us up with him and seated us with him in the heavenly places." Here, believers have experienced a spiritual resurrection and are enjoying a heavenly existence in the here and now. This is precisely the view that Paul argued against in his letter to the Corinthians. Wow, I have to say, this again is incredibly weak. Ehrman's idea that Ephesians leans too heavily on the idea that everything already happening doesn't quite add up. He thinks the author of Ephesians also wrote Colossians, so the same arguments for forgery likely apply to both. But Luke Timothy Johnson's response to this realized eschatology objection, I think hits the nail on the head. Johnson writes, apart from the issue of how much latitude an author has before he reaches self-inconsistency, and apart from the rather obvious shifts in eschatological emphasis in the undisputed letters, this charge simply misreads these sections of Colossians. It is clear from 2:20 and 3:1-4 that death to sin and baptism leads to a resurrection life, not of glory but of faith, which requires of the Colossians a conversion of their behavior. Their life indeed is hid with Christ in God. Only at the end, when Christ our life appears, will they themselves be in a state of glory. The language is slightly different, but the thought is virtually identical with what is found in Romans 6:1-14. And though the language underscores the transformation of human character that has occurred through faith and baptism, one has died to the old and has been raised to new life, it should not be taken as a statement on eschatology as such. Also, just look at Romans 8:30. Paul says that believers are already, present tense, glorified in Christ, right now, even though a few verses before he talks about the future resurrection. Does that mean that Romans has too much of a realized eschatology, making it also suspect? All of Ehrman's arguments in Forged regarding Ephesians and Colossians really fail to convince. But what evidence supports the genuineness of these letters? Let's explore the positive case. Firstly, let's consider the external evidence. Ephesians and Colossians were highly regarded among early Christian writings. Ephesians was praised by Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Ignatius, the Didache, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, the Muratorian Canon, which is an early Christian manuscript listing canonical books, and Origen. Colossians also received similar acknowledgement, albeit without Polycarp and Clement of Rome. Interestingly, even the infamous heretic Marcion included these letters in his canon, and they were also referenced by the Gnostic Valentinius. These epistles were extensively referenced by church leaders and heretics throughout the early period of the church. Surprisingly, doubts about their authorship only emerged in the late 18th century. In a nutshell, in the ancient church, all 13 of the Pauline letters were unanimously ascribed to the Apostle Paul. Keep in mind that this unanimity didn't extend to all beloved books, as doubts arose about the authorship of other texts like Hebrews, 2 Peter, 2 and 3 John, and Revelation. But those doubts never extended to the Pauline letters in our Bibles today. Now let's move on to the internal evidence. Let's focus on the evidence that links Onesimus to the city of Colossae. Virtually all scholars acknowledge that Paul wrote Philemon. In the letter addressed to Philemon, we learn that Onesimus was actually a servant or slave of Philemon. So where did Philemon live? Oddly enough, the letter doesn't directly say where he was from, but there's a clue. Philemon seems to be connected to a well-known Christian named Archippus from the same place. In Philemon 1:2 we read, Paul, a prisoner of Jesus Christ, and Timothy our brother, to Philemon our beloved co-worker, and to our dear Apphia, Archippus our fellow soldier, and to the church in your house. Now if we backtrack to the letter to the Colossians, we find that Archippus is specifically greeted by name among the Christians in that church, along with an instruction which says, "Tell Archippus, see to it that you complete the ministry you have received in the Lord." The idea that Onesimus was from the same city as Philemon seems either to be a consistent detail between the texts, or a complex network of forgeries that strangely fit together. A forger intentionally creating this connection seems very unlikely. Not only would most readers miss the intended point of saying he is one of you in our letter, but the steps needed to connect Onesimus to Philemon, Philemon to Archippus, and Archippus to Colossae are too complicated. Would a forger really expect readers to dig through multiple letters and make these connections? This alignment isn't just about confirming Onesimus' link to Colossae, it also reveals several other details. Philemon is encouraged to welcome Onesimus, whom Paul fondly calls my very heart, and Paul indicates that he became a son like him during his imprisonment. So from that earlier mention, it seems Onesimus was around when Paul wrote his epistle to the Colossians, because Paul wrote that letter from prison, which he talked about in Colossians 4:3 when he mentions that he's in chains. Paul also asked Philemon to get a guest room ready, hoping that with their prayers he'd soon be set free. This completely lines up with his expectation of getting out soon, which he mentioned in another letter, which is Philippians. Just check out verses 2:23 through 24. Since Paul wrote letters to Philemon and the Colossians at the same time, both were delivered by the same person, one addressed to an individual and another to the whole Colossian group. It's expected that they'd include similar people sending their regards. And yep, we see names like Aristarchus, Mark, and Epaphras, Luke, Demas, and Timothy in both letters. Just check out Philemon 1:23 through 24. But here's the catch. While these names appear in both letters, there's a difference. In Colossians, Aristarchus is called a fellow prisoner, see Colossians 4:10, but in Philemon, he's mentioned without this title. Instead, the term fellow prisoner is used for Epaphras. A forger would have made sure that there was more of an alignment in the terms. Furthermore, in Colossians, Philemon isn't even mentioned. And details about Onesimus as a servant, his mistakes, escape, or conversion aren't even brought up. If the Colossians letter were a fake, it certainly missed a chance to make a clear connection with the letter of Philemon. If we establish Philemon as genuine, and note its close ties with Colossians through the shared names of Paul's friends and companions, then the relationship between Ephesians and Colossians becomes very significant. Both mention Tychicus as the letter carrier, a detail found nowhere else. Interestingly, the strongest verbal similarity between these two letters in Ephesians 6:21 and 22, and Colossians 4:7 through 8, containing a sequence of 32 consecutive words that are identical in the standard Greek New Testaments. Suppose these three letters were dispatched by Paul via Tychicus from Rome at the same time. In this scenario, Ephesus would have been the next logical stop on the way to Colossae, enabling all necessary deliveries. Now let's take a look at some supporting evidence from the book of Acts. Paul's letters, like the ones to the Colossians and Ephesians, match up pretty well with his life story in Acts. It's almost too precise to be a fluke, but too indirect to be planned or copied. This points strongly to their authenticity. In these letters, Paul talks about why he's in prison. It's not just because he preached Christianity, but because he stood up for the right of Gentile people to join the faith without following all the Jewish rules. He saw this as a big deal, even a reason for his suffering. Like in Colossians 1:24, where he's happy to go through hard times for their sake, even though he hadn't met them. Then in Ephesians 3:1, he calls himself a prisoner of Jesus Christ for you Gentiles. In Colossians 4:3, Paul asks for prayers to share the mystery of Christ, which he talks about more in Ephesians. This mystery is about how Gentile people are part of God's plan, just like the Jews, all because of the gospel. It lines up exactly with what we read in Romans 16:25 through 26. Now let's compare this with Luke's historical account. In the book of Acts, after Paul's return to Jerusalem, an uproar arises due to his teachings about allowing Gentiles into the faith. Though the legal accusations against him concern temple desecration, his mission to the Gentiles is the real bone of contention, as he openly acknowledges. His imprisonment isn't due to a general Christian persecution. At this particular time, others preached similarly without as much trouble. It was solely because of his insistence on equality for Gentiles within the faith. These letters from his imprisonment remarkably align with his account of why he was in prison in the first place. But there's actually more. In Colossians 4:10 through 11, we read, "My fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. You have received instructions about him. If he comes to you, welcome him. Jesus, who is called Justus, also sends his greetings." Aristarchus is mentioned as Paul's companion in Acts 19 during a chaotic scene in Ephesus. Later in Acts 27, he's noted as being with Paul on the journey to Rome. The writer of this letter seems to include Aristarchus among the greetings, possibly because he knew Aristarchus had traveled with Paul to Rome, but he makes no references to the scenes from Acts. However, there's more to this coincidence. Alongside Aristarchus, the writer includes Mark and Justus, whose journey to Rome isn't documented in Acts. If the writer had solely based the list by referencing Acts, it's likely only Aristarchus would have been mentioned. Furthermore, the mention of Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, sheds light on Barnabas' favoritism towards Mark. This relates to the rift between Paul and Barnabas regarding Mark's involvement in their travels, as documented in the book of Acts. Interestingly, the historical account of their dispute in Acts doesn't mention Mark's relation to Barnabas, unlike the detail found in his letter. Finally, there's an interesting detail in Ephesians 6:19-20, where Paul speaks about boldly preaching while he's in chains, using the Greek word desmios, specifically meaning in a chain or bound. In Acts 28, it's mentioned that Paul was under house arrest in Rome and chained to a soldier. This form of custody, where a prisoner was bound to a soldier by a single chain, is precisely what Paul describes in Ephesians. This specific term, desmios, used in Ephesians, aligns only with this type of custody and isn't used elsewhere for different kinds of imprisonment in the New Testament. All these little connections make sense if these letters are really from Paul, but if they were fake, these details would be quite surprising. So, in summary, the evidence both inside and outside these letters stands very strong. Ehrman's claims about conflicting theologies in Paul's other letters doesn't really hold up to scrutiny, and his arguments about different usage of words or the way Paul spoke just isn't very weighty. There are strong reasons, both from the early church fathers and internal evidence, to support Paul's authorship of the letters attributed to him, and there aren't convincing grounds to label them as forgeries. Ultimately, our New Testament retains 13 genuine letters from the Apostle Paul.